The obese girl heard someone crying in the woods. She found the mountain man who had lost everything. The wilderness of Western Virginia in 1793 stretched endless and unforgiving, a realm where civilization's reach grew thin as morning mist. Here, among the towering pines and ancient oaks, where the Appalachian Mountains rose like sentinels guarding secrets older than memory, Sarah Whitmore made her solitary way through the forest. She was not meant for this harsh frontier life, or so the whispers back in the settlement suggested. At 23 years old and considerably heavier than the lean, weathered women who'd learned to survive in these unforgiving lands, Sarah had endured more than her share of sidelong glances and barely concealed mockery. Her father, a failed merchant from Philadelphia, had dragged the family westward 3 years prior, chasing dreams of land and prosperity that had dissolved like smoke. When fever took both her parents last winter, Sarah found herself alone, living in a small cabin on the edge of the settlement, taking in washing and mending to earn her keep. The townspeople tolerated her existence, but rarely included her in their gatherings. She was too soft, they said, too citified, too large to be of use in the demanding work of frontier survival. Sarah had learned to find solace in solitude, taking long walks through the forest, where the trees didn't judge and the wind didn't whisper cruel assessments of her worth. It was on such a walk, on a crisp October afternoon, when the leaves blazed gold and crimson against an impossibly blue sky, that Sarah heard the sound that would change her life forever. A sob, raw and desperate, echoing through the cathedral of pines. Sarah froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. The sound came again, a man's voice, broken with grief so profound it seemed to shake the very air. Without thinking, driven by an instinct she didn't pause to examine, Sarah pushed through the undergrowth toward the sound. She found him in a small clearing beside a creek, collapsed on his knees beside 3 freshly dug graves. He was a giant of a man, broad-shouldered and tall, dressed in buckskins that had seen hard use. His dark hair hung past his shoulders, tangled and unkempt, and his bearded face was buried in his hands as his body shook with the force of his weeping. Sarah had never seen a man cry like this, with complete abandon, as if he'd forgotten the world existed beyond his grief. Something in her chest cracked at the sight. "Sir?" she called softly, not wanting to startle him. The man's head snapped up, and Sarah found herself staring into eyes the color of storm clouds, red-rimmed and wild with anguish. For a moment she thought he might bolt like a frightened animal, but instead he simply stared at her, seeming not to comprehend her presence. "Are you hurt?" Sarah asked, taking a cautious step forward. "Can I help?" A bitter laugh escaped him, harsh as a crow's cry. "Help? There ain't no help for what's been done, woman. There ain't no help in this world or the next." His voice was rough, edged with an accent she couldn't quite place, something of the mountains, something of the frontier that had swallowed so many and spat back so few. She could see now that while his face was lined with grief and weather, he couldn't be much older than 30. There was dried blood on his hands, and his buckskins were torn in places. "What happened?" Sarah asked, her voice gentle. She'd learned that sometimes the greatest kindness was simply to listen. The man looked back at the graves, his jaw working. "Everything," he said finally. "I lost everything." He told her then, haltingly at first, and then in a rush like a dam breaking, the story of how he'd left his cabin that morning to check his trap lines, how he'd heard the war cries of a Shawnee raiding party and raced back, but too late, always too late. His wife Mary, their 5-year-old daughter Emma, and his wife's elderly mother, all dead. The cabin burned. Everything he'd built in 5 years of brutal labor gone in a morning's violence. "I fought 'em," he said, his voice hollow. "Killed 3 before they scattered, but what good did it do? What good's any of it?" Sarah's eyes stung with tears. She'd known loss. Her parents' death had carved a hollow in her chest that still ached on cold nights. But this was devastation on a scale she could barely fathom. To lose not just loved ones, but one's entire world, one's reason for existing, all in a single terrible morning. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, knowing the words were inadequate, but having nothing else to offer. "You from the settlement?" he asked abruptly, studying her with those storm cloud eyes. "You one of them folks who think these mountains belong to them just 'cause they built some houses and cleared some land?" "I'm from the settlement," Sarah admitted, "but I don't think the land belongs to anyone but itself. I'm just passing through same as everyone else." Something shifted in his expression. He looked at her properly now, taking in her simple homespun dress, her sturdy boots, the way she stood without the fashionable posture the ladies back east cultivated. Her size didn't seem to register with him, or perhaps in his grief. Such considerations were too trivial to notice. "Name's Jacob Thorne," he said finally. "Folks used to call me the Mountain Man, on account of I spent more time up in the high country than down in the valleys." "Sarah Whitmore," she replied. I have a cabin. It's not much, but there's food and a fire. You shouldn't be alone right now." Jacob shook his head. "Got nowhere else to be. Nowhere that matters." "Then come with me," Sarah said firmly, surprised by the authority in her own voice. "At least for tonight. You can't stay here in the dark with—" She gestured at the graves, unable to finish. For a long moment, Jacob didn't respond. Then, moving like a man underwater, he rose to his feet. He was even taller than she'd thought, towering over her by more than a foot. He looked down at the graves one last time, his face a mask of such profound sorrow that Sarah had to look away. "I'll come," he said quietly, "but only for tonight." The walk back to her cabin took nearly an hour, and they made it in silence. Jacob moved through the forest like a ghost, his feet finding paths Sarah couldn't see, his presence somehow both solid and ethereal. She found herself acutely aware of him, the way he moved, the set of his shoulders, the occasional catch in his breath that suggested tears not quite suppressed. Her cabin was small and plain, but it was clean and well maintained. Sarah had taken pride in making it a home, even if she lived there alone. She stoked the fire while Jacob stood in the doorway, seeming uncertain whether to enter. "Sit," Sarah instructed, pointing to the rough-hewn table. "I'll make something to eat." "Ain't hungry," Jacob muttered, but he sat anyway, his large frame making her small chair look like a child's toy. Sarah prepared a simple meal of cornmeal mush, salt pork, and beans. Frontier fare, nothing fancy, but filling and warm. She set a bowl in front of Jacob and sat across from him with her own. He stared at the food as if he'd forgotten what it was for. "Eat," Sarah said softly. "You'll need your strength." "For what?" The bitterness in his voice was sharp enough to cut. "For whatever comes next," Sarah replied. "For living." "Don't want to live?" Jacob said, and the flatness of his tone was more frightening than anger would have been. Sarah set down her spoon and looked at him directly. "I understand that feeling," she said. When my parents died last winter, I spent 3 days sitting in this cabin, staring at the walls, wishing I could just stop. Stop breathing, stop thinking, stop feeling. Jacob's eyes lifted to meet hers, and for the first time she saw a flicker of something other than grief, a recognition, perhaps, of shared pain. "What changed?" he asked. Sarah smiled sadly. "Nothing changed. The world kept turning whether I wanted it to or not. I realized that I could either let it crush me or I could find a way to keep going. Not because I was strong or brave, but because the alternative was to let the darkness win." "Maybe the darkness deserves to win," Jacob said. "Maybe," Sarah acknowledged, "but not today. Today, you eat this food and you sleep in a warm place, and tomorrow you can decide what comes next." They ate in silence after that. Jacob managed only a few bites, but Sarah counted it as a victory. When the meal was finished, she showed him to the small loft where she kept her spare bedding. "You can sleep up there," she said. "I'll stay down here by the fire." "This is your cabin," Jacob protested weakly. "I can't." "You can and you will," Sarah interrupted. "I'll hear no argument." For the first time, the ghost of a smile touched Jacob's ravaged face. "You're a forceful woman, Sarah Whitmore." "When I need to be," she replied. That night, Sarah lay awake by the fire, listening to the sounds of Jacob's restless sleep above her. Twice she heard him cry out, and once she heard him weeping again, but she didn't intrude. Some griefs were too private to share, even with a stranger who'd shown kindness. When morning came, Sarah woke to find Jacob sitting at her table, staring at his hands. She built up the fire and prepared a simple breakfast of cornmeal cakes and wild honey. They ate together, and this time Jacob managed to finish his portion. "Thank you," he said finally, "for last night, for not treating me like I was broken beyond fixing." "Everyone's broken in some way," Sarah said. "It's how we mend that matters." Jacob studied her with those storm cloud eyes, and Sarah felt her cheeks grow warm under his scrutiny. "Why are you alone out here?" he asked. "A woman like you should have family, a husband, people to look after you." The familiar shame stirred in Sarah's chest, but she pushed it down. "I'm not what most men are looking for in a wife," she said carefully. "I'm too large, too plain, too much of everything they don't want." Jacob frowned. "That's fool talk," he said bluntly. "Any man with eyes can see you got a kind heart and a strong spirit. The rest don't matter worth a damn." Tears pricked at Sarah's eyes, and she blinked them away quickly. "That's kind of you to say." "Ain't kindness," Jacob said. "It's truth. I've lived in these mountains long enough to know what's valuable and what ain't. A person's character, their capacity for compassion, that's what matters. The rest is just decoration." They fell into an uneasy rhythm after that. Jacob had said he'd only stay one night, but when the second evening came, he made no move to leave. Sarah didn't press him. She understood instinctively that he needed time, needed a place to begin the long, painful process of healing. During the days, Jacob would disappear into the forest, sometimes for hours. Sarah worried, but didn't follow, sensing he needed the solitude. He always returned before dark, often bringing meat from his hunting, a rabbit, a brace of quail, once a young deer that provided them with food for weeks. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, and slowly, gradually, Jacob began to talk. He told her about his life before the tragedy, how he'd come west from Virginia's Tidewater region as a young man, seeking freedom and adventure. How he'd met Mary at a trading post, a frontier girl with dark braids and a laugh like running water. How Emma had been born during a terrible winter storm, and how he'd held his daughter for the first time with hands that shook with joy and terror. He spoke of the small farm he'd carved from the wilderness, the cabin he'd built log by log, the dreams he'd harbored of creating something lasting in this wild land. And he spoke, with a pain that never diminished, of how those dreams had burned to ash in a single morning. Sarah listened, and in listening, she found herself sharing her own stories. She told Jacob about growing up in Philadelphia, the daughter of a merchant whose ambitions always exceeded his abilities, about the move west that her father had promised would save them, and how instead it had led to their deaths, about the loneliness of being the outsider in the settlement, too different to fit in, too proud to beg for acceptance. "They mock you?" Jacob asked one evening, anger flashing in his eyes. Sarah shrugged. "Not overtly, but I hear the whispers. Poor Sarah, if only she were smaller, prettier, more refined, she might find a husband. As if a husband is the only thing that could give my life meaning." "Fools," Jacob muttered, "every last one of them." As the weeks passed and autumn deepened toward winter, Sarah noticed changes in Jacob. The raw, open wound of his grief began to scab over, though she knew it would never fully heal. He smiled occasionally, usually at something she said or did. He helped her with the heavier chores around the cabin, splitting wood, repairing the roof before the snows came, hunting to build up their winter stores. The settlement buzzed with gossip about the mountain man living in Sarah Whitmore's cabin. She heard the whispers when she went to trade her mending for supplies. Some were scandalized, others pitying, a few outright cruel in their speculation. "Let them talk," Jacob said when she mentioned it. "Small minds always do." "It doesn't bother you?" Sarah asked. "That people might think—" "Think what? That we're living in sin?" Jacob laughed, though there was little humor in it. "Sarah, I've buried my wife and child. I've killed men in battle. I've survived things that would break most folks. You think I care what a bunch of settlement gossips think about where I lay my head at night?" But Sarah cared, not because she was ashamed, but because she'd come to value Jacob's presence in her life more than she wanted to admit. In the quiet evenings by the fire, in the comfortable silences they shared, in the way he looked at her as if she were a person of worth and substance, Sarah had found something she'd never expected to have: companionship. Perhaps even friendship. The first snow came in late November, a light dusting that turned the forest into a wonderland of white. Sarah woke to find Jacob already up, staring out the small window at the transformed landscape. "Beautiful, ain't it?" he said quietly. "Emma used to love the snow. First time she saw it, she was just 2 years old. Ran right out into it in her nightdress, laughing like it was the greatest magic in the world." Sarah came to stand beside him, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Tell me about her," she said softly. "Tell me what she was like." And Jacob did. He spoke of his daughter's curiosity, her fearlessness, her habit of talking to animals as if they could understand every word. He spoke of Mary's patience and strength, her skill with herbs and healing, the way she'd made their rough cabin into a home. "You must think I'm weak," Jacob said finally, "a man who can't let go of the past." "I think you're human," Sarah replied, "and I think the measure of how much you love them is in how much it hurts to lose them. That's not weakness, Jacob. That's proof of the best parts of your heart." He turned to look at her then, and Sarah saw something shift in his expression. He reached out, slowly, as if afraid she might disappear, and gently brushed a strand of hair from her face. His hand was rough and calloused, but his touch was impossibly gentle. "Sarah," he said, his voice rough with emotion, I ain't good with words, not the fancy kind, but I need you to know that these weeks with you, you've given me a reason to keep breathing when I thought I'd never want to again." Sarah's heart hammered in her chest. "Jacob, Let me finish," he interrupted gently. "I know I got no right to feel anything but grief. I know it ain't been but 2 months since I lost everything. But you've been a light in the darkness, Sarah. You've shown me that maybe someday there could be a reason to hope again." "You don't have to explain," Sarah whispered. "I understand." "Do you?" Jacob asked, and now both his hands framed her face, his thumbs brushing her cheeks with infinite tenderness. "Do you understand that when I look at you, I see strength and kindness and beauty that has nothing to do with what those fools in the settlement think? Do you understand that you've become necessary to me?" Sarah felt tears slip down her cheeks, but they weren't tears of sadness. "I see the same in you," she confessed. "A good man who's been broken by circumstances beyond his control, but who's still standing, still fighting, still capable of compassion even in the midst of his own pain." Jacob leaned forward, moving slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. But Sarah didn't pull away. When his lips met hers, it was the gentlest of kisses, tentative and questioning. Sarah answered by pressing closer, her hands finding the solid warmth of his chest. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and Jacob rested his forehead against hers. "I won't dishonor Mary's memory," he said quietly, "but I also can't ignore what I'm feeling. Is that wrong?" "No," Sarah said firmly. "Love doesn't diminish love, Jacob. What you felt for Mary, what you'll always feel for her, that's sacred and permanent. But human hearts are large enough to hold more than one love if we let them." Winter closed in around them, and with it came a kind of cocoon that wrapped around the small cabin. Snows fell deep, cutting them off from the settlement for days at a time. Jacob and Sarah settled into a domestic rhythm that felt both natural and miraculous. They cooked together, worked together, sat by the fire in the evenings while Jacob whittled and Sarah mended, and slowly, tentatively, they explored the growing affection between them. Jacob was patient, never pushing, always mindful of Sarah's inexperience and his own recent loss. They held hands while walking through the snow-laden forest. They shared longer, deeper kisses by the firelight. They talked about everything and nothing, building a foundation of trust and understanding. "Tell me about Philadelphia," Jacob said one evening. "What was it like growing up in a city?" Sarah smiled, remembering. Crowded, noisy. So many people pressed together, all with their own concerns and ambitions. Sometimes I felt like I was drowning in all those people, all that noise. But there were good things, too. Bookshops and theaters, the smell of bread from the bakeries, the way the sun looked setting over the Delaware River. "Do you miss it?" Jacob asked. Sarah considered. "Sometimes I miss the things that made life easier. Shops close by, a physician if you needed one, other women to talk to. but I don't miss the feeling of being watched and judged all the time. Out here, away from the settlement, I can just be." "You're remarkable, you know that?" Jacob said, and the sincerity in his voice made Sarah's heart ache with happiness. "I'm just ordinary," she protested. "No," Jacob said firmly. "Ordinary women would have passed me by in the forest that day. Ordinary women would have been frightened or disgusted or too concerned with propriety to help. You saw someone in pain, and you didn't hesitate. That ain't ordinary, Sarah. That's extraordinary." As winter deepened, they grew closer still. Jacob began sleeping in the loft less frequently, instead pulling his bedroll close to the fire where Sarah lay. They would talk late into the night, their voices soft in the darkness, occasionally reaching out to touch hands or faces in the flickering firelight. It was on a night when the wind howled outside and the fire burned low that Jacob finally spoke the words that had been building between them for weeks. "Sarah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I know it ain't been long. I know folks would say I'm rushing, that I haven't mourned proper. But I need you to know that I love you, not the same way I loved Mary. That was different. That was young and fresh and built over years. This love, it's different. It's built on understanding and shared pain and the kind of recognition that happens when two souls find each other in the darkness." Sarah's breath caught. "Jacob, You don't have to say it back," Jacob continued, raising up on one elbow to look at her in the dim light. "I just needed you to know. You've saved my life, Sarah Whitmore, in every way that matters. And if you'll have me, if you can accept a broken man with more scars than future, I'd like to spend whatever time I got left making you happy." "You're not broken," Sarah said, her own voice thick with emotion. "You're healing. And yes, Jacob Thorne, I love you too. I think I've loved you since that day in the forest, though I was too afraid to acknowledge it. This time when they kissed, it was with the promise of forever in it. And when spring came and the snows melted, revealing a world renewed, they stood before the settlement circuit preacher and spoke vows that bound them together in the eyes of God and man. The settlement gossiped, of course. The mountain man and the obese girl, they whispered, as if it were the strangest pairing imaginable. But Jacob and Sarah paid them no mind. They had found in each other something more valuable than acceptance or approval. They had found home. Jacob built a new cabin, larger than the one he'd lost, on a piece of land that Sarah had inherited from her father. It was situated at the edge of the settlement, close enough for convenience, but far enough for the privacy they both craved. He worked with a fierce determination, as if by building something new he could honor what he'd lost while embracing what he'd found. Sarah tended a garden that grew larger each year, learning from the other settlement women who, gradually, began to accept her, now that she was a married woman with a provider. She never forgot their earlier coldness, but she chose to forgive it, understanding that people feared what they didn't understand. In the spring of their second year together, Sarah found herself with child. The pregnancy was difficult. She'd always been a large woman, and carrying a baby strained her body in ways she hadn't anticipated. Jacob hovered over her like a worried bear, fetching and carrying, insisting she rest, driving her to distraction with his concern. "I'm not made of glass," Sarah protested one day when Jacob had forbidden her from lifting a basket of washing. "No," Jacob agreed, pulling her close and resting his hand on her swollen belly. you're made of something much stronger. But that don't mean I can't worry about you. I've lost too much already, Sarah. I couldn't bear to lose you, too." "You won't," Sarah assured him, covering his hand with hers. "I'm too stubborn to leave you, Jacob Thorne." Their daughter was born on a hot August night, after a labor that lasted nearly 2 days. The settlement midwife, Mrs. Cooper, stayed with them throughout, and when the baby finally emerged, red-faced and wailing, she placed the infant in Sarah's arms with a smile. "A healthy girl," Mrs. Cooper announced, "and fighting mad about being brought into the world. She'll be a handful, this one." Jacob, who had spent the labor pacing outside like a caged animal, burst into the cabin the moment Mrs. Cooper called for him. He looked at Sarah, exhausted and tear-stained, but radiant with joy, holding their daughter, and his own eyes filled with tears. "She's perfect," he whispered, kneeling beside the bed and gently touching the baby's tiny fist. "You're both perfect." They named her Hope, Hope Mary Thorne, after the new life she represented and the lost love Jacob still carried in his heart. Sarah had suggested the middle name, and Jacob had wept again, grateful beyond words for her understanding and generosity of spirit. Hope grew strong and healthy, developing her father's storm-cloud eyes and her mother's determined disposition. She was followed 2 years later by a son they named Thomas, and then another daughter, Grace, 2 years after that. Life settled into a rhythm of seasons and small joys. Jacob became known throughout the settlement as a fair man, skilled in the woods and honest in his dealings. He served as a scout and guide for newcomers, using his knowledge of the mountains to help others establish their own farms and cabins. He never forgot his first family, and once a year he would make the long journey to the graves in the clearing, bringing flowers in the summer or evergreen boughs in the winter. Sarah had insisted on accompanying him after that first year, wanting to pay her respects to the people who had made Jacob who he was. She stood beside him at the graves, holding Hope in her arms, and offered her own prayer for the family that had been lost. "Thank you," she whispered to the woman she'd never known. "Thank you for loving him and teaching him how to love. I promise I'll take care of him, and I'll make sure your memory is honored." Jacob had heard her words and pulled her close, this woman who had saved him in every way possible, and silently thanked God or fate or whatever force had led her into the woods on that terrible October day. As the years passed, Sarah and Jacob became pillars of their community. Their cabin was known as a place where travelers could find a meal and a warm welcome, where neighbors in trouble could seek help without judgment. Sarah's skills as a healer, learned partly from books she'd brought from Philadelphia and partly from experimentation and observation, made her invaluable to the settlement. The children grew strong and healthy, shaped by the love of their parents and the harsh demands of frontier life. Hope, true to Mrs. Cooper's prediction, was indeed a handful, fearless and curious, always pushing boundaries. Thomas was quieter, more thoughtful, with a talent for working with wood that reminded everyone of his father. Grace was the mediator, the peacemaker, always finding ways to smooth over her siblings' conflicts. On a warm evening in late summer, when Hope was 14 and beginning to show signs of the beautiful woman she would become, Sarah and Jacob sat on the porch of their cabin, watching the sun set over the mountains they'd made their home. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked quietly. "The life we've built, I mean. I know it's not what you imagined when you first came west." Jacob turned to look at her, this woman who had been his salvation and his second chance at happiness, and shook his head firmly. "Not for a single moment," he said. "What we have, what we've built together, it's more than I ever thought I'd have again after that day in the forest." "I've found you broken," Sarah said, taking his hand. "And I found you hiding," Jacob replied, "hiding from a world that couldn't see what you really were." "What am I?" Sarah asked, though by now she knew the answer. Jacob smiled, that rare, beautiful smile that still had the power to make her heart skip a beat. "You're the strongest person I've ever known. You're the kindest soul I've ever met. You're the love I didn't dare hope for. You're my wife, the mother of my children, and the reason I wake up every morning grateful to be alive." From inside the cabin came the sounds of their children arguing over something trivial, and both parents laughed. "I should go referee," Sarah said, starting to rise. But Jacob pulled her back down, wrapping an arm around her shoulders and holding her close. "Let them work it out," he said. "Just stay here with me a moment longer. Let me hold you and remember how lucky I am." Sarah settled against his solid warmth, watching the last rays of sunlight paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, and thought about the unlikely journey that had brought them to this moment. She'd been a lonely, mocked outsider, and he'd been a man destroyed by loss, and together they'd built something neither could have created alone. "I love you, Jacob Thorne," she said softly. "I love you too, Sarah Thorne," he replied, "forever and always." As darkness fell and the first stars appeared in the deepening sky, they sat together in the peace they'd earned through pain and perseverance, surrounded by the family they'd created and the life they'd built from the ashes of their separate griefs. It wasn't the life either had imagined in their youth, but it was real and solid and good. And in the end, that was more than enough.